Hello everyone, and welcome back to you regulars out there. This week I'm happy to present an update on the Guardsman project. This is my big project for 2021, which consists of turning an eBay lot of used Warhammer 40,000 miniatures into a playable army for the Astra Militarum in Warhammer 40,000, or any generic sci-fi universe aside from that. In this episode, I finally settle on a paint scheme, and then I prepare the first 6 infantry models for that army. If you're interested in some basic conversion work on used models purchased off of eBay or otherwise purchased secondhand, then this is the episode for you. As usual, I like to go over everything from start to finish in these videos so that even if you're a beginner who's never really tried doing any of these sort of projects before, hopefully I can give you an idea of the steps you'll need from preparation all the way out to finishing off your miniatures. For this project, I grabbed 6 of the better looking used miniatures I had because I didn't want to have to fuss with it too much, and I'm going to take these and clean them off. I always clean off every miniature just to make sure there's no products on there that could prevent paint from sticking. And the product I'm using here for cleaning, Simple Green, will also help me strip off any extra paint on these models. Since they appear to only have a blue primer, not much came off. You can see there's a couple of areas where it's scraped free, which is fine. I want to get rid of anything that wasn't sticking perfectly tight. And a lot of the models came apart because the glue fell apart in the Simple Green. That's fine by me. I'll reassemble them, and in a lot of cases, the models being disassembled make it easier for me to sculpt details onto them afterwards. That putty that I just held up in front of the screen is green stuff. It's commonly used by miniature modelers as an acrylic putty for sculpting on models. I'll get to that in a minute. First though, there's still some prep work I need to do as far as getting the miniatures actually ready where I want them to be. For one thing, I don't want the skull and bird aesthetic going on with my custom army, so I'm going to be scraping off all of the little Imperial Aquillas from armor, weapons, and helmets. I use a metal file and then go in with just a fine grit sandpaper afterwards to smooth things off. I'm not too worried about it being a little rough, but get things as smooth as possible. I'm also going to cut down the las guns on these guys so they look a little more practical, let's say. That could have been a flash hider or suppressor with a little bit of conversion as well, but I think just the short-barreled rifle or carbine design looks good for something that space warriors might need to carry on board their spacecraft or in their vehicles. If during sanding you find little nooks like this that are hard to sand by hand because they're obstructed in one way or another, you can wrap some sandpaper around a pair of tweezers and just sort of pinch it tightly this way. That'll give you a small pointed bit of sandpaper that can get into an area and give you basically the same effect as a needle file. You can also get little needle files from the cosmetic area of a drugstore if you want to cut this process off, but I'm just using what I've got on hand right now. For the actual barrels of the guns, I was going to drill them out, but my drill bit, as you can see, is kind of a bit too large. It would actually remove that little stubby barrel sticking out of the end of the gun, which I want to keep. On my test model, I didn't keep it, but I found the gun looked a little squared off. By keeping just a little bit of barrel, it adds a little bit of interest. So I'm just going to poke it out with this sculpting tool that has a needle on the end. Now we're going to get into sculpting with green stuff, and this is super interesting. It is, as I mentioned, the sort of putty that's most commonly used by sculptors for miniatures, as far as I can tell, and there's some pretty good reasons for that. It's a 2-part putty that, if you mix both parts, the blue and the yellowish green together, you'll get a green mixture, and you can mix them 50-50, which makes it easy to do just straight up, and that's how I'm going to mix it here, roughly 50-50. But the more you put in of one or the other, the more your consistency will change and your drying time will change, which actually makes it a really flexible material to use. If you put in more yellow, you're going to get a less firm, more malleable, and slower drying substance, whereas if you put in more blue, you get something harder that's a little easier to sculpt sort of hard edges onto, though it's a little more rigid. So there's a lot you can do with this, but for the simplest result, you're just going to have to grab 2 bits, 50-50, and knead them together. This is sped up 4 times. It is a pretty slow process to do this. Once you've kneaded it together, though, it should be a very even green color all the way across, and it's going to be a little sticky. One of the things you really want to have on hand while you're working with this is some sort of glass of water, or I've heard some people use Vaseline. I find it gets in the way, and it's so persistent that you can't stick other bits of green stuff on top of what you've already applied, which is not great for me because I am kind of just bashing things together. So I like using water personally. You can also cut it with an X-Acto knife or a scalpel if you have one. and just shape things. In my previous test model, I'd had a squared off visor, but this time I wanted something a little rounder. So I'm just going to cut it to conform with the helmet, and then smooth it down with my finger and with these silicone sculpting tools that I bought off of Amazon. For the backpack, again, I'm looking for something somewhat low profile, so in this case I just went for sort of a boxy shape with an access hatch on the back. I wanted to imply some sort of self-contained breathing apparatus or communications unit on the backpack. The other thing I wanted to have was an antenna, because I think communications is quite important for any sort of soldiers of the future, and although theoretically maybe the antenna could be built into the helmet, presumably all their communications equipment is inside the helmet after all, the antenna looks cool. So these guys are really a sort of middling the distance between what's reasonable and what looks artistically interesting and what's fun to design, I guess. This will be even more apparent once we get to the actual camouflage scheme, as you probably saw from the start. It's not exactly in line with the principles of camouflage, but it's interesting, it's fun, and it does some really nice contrasting things in terms of just visual design. So I was quite happy with it. As far as the antenna and helmet connection, I just poked some holes and stuck some little bits of jewelry wire in, just snipped them down to size and shove them in there. Green stuff's pretty sticky, so it'll hold them in place, and I'll put a little bit of super glue on afterwards to hold them in place even more tightly. As my wife rightly pointed out, having a helmet connection on the back is not very convenient for the user, but A, it looks kind of cool and it adds some detail to the backpack, and B, I didn't want to mess up the profile of the full domed reflective visor, so again, art won out over practicality. As far as the green stuff goes once it's set, you can see it's hardened up now and I can scrape it down with an X-Acto knife. I can do also sanding at this point. Just let it set up and it gets very, very solid. If you want something that sands even better, because I wouldn't go straight to sanding with the 50-50 consistency, it tends to gum up the sandpaper because it's still a little bit rubbery. If you put in more blue to your mixture of green stuff, you're going to end up with something that's a little more rigid still and sands, in my opinion, even better. But scraping with an X-Acto knife is perfectly fine for just sort of smoothing surfaces down. Now here I'm just turning in the helmet connector now that everything is dried and set up. It's a little safer to be bending it and stuff like that. I won't tear the backpack out of shape in the way that just shoving the wires in was doing while it was still soft. So I'll turn it to face the helmet, and I'll just take that opportunity to apply a little bit of glue to both sides, both on the bottom, since I twisted it, it doesn't have as good of a connection with the green stuff anymore, and on the top, where it's going to connect to the helmet so that it's solidly affixed. I can also use the knife to scrape off any areas on the miniature where I had left details that I hadn't properly sanded off. For example, on the rifle there where I took the Aquila off, there's still a little bit of a lip, so by scraping the X-Acto knife along that surface, not blade down, but sort of blade away from the direction that you're scraping, you can get a pretty nice sort of slow smoothing effect and just remove any really big jutting out parts. If you choose to go back to the file and sandpaper like I did here, just remember that a metal file will leave scrapes in the green stuff that you need to sand down afterwards. For actually basing the models, I'm going to use the same method that I've been using on a lot of my models recently, with a minor exception in the order of operations. So first I put a lot of super glue onto the base. Now I'm going to sprinkle little nuggets of clay cat litter on. And that'll let me sort of sprinkle them without them bouncing off of the miniature. I used to frequently do it after I put the miniature down, but this way I get to lay them in and I can go a little denser and make a little more of a gravel surface instead of just a couple of rocks on the base, which I kind of like, especially for the sort of semi-arid terrain that these guys are going to occupy. Afterwards I sprinkle on baking soda. This fulfills the dual role of looking a little bit like sand and also helping the super glue set up because it is a catalyst for super glue. This method also works for models with the old slotted bases. Just cover the base in super glue like you would do normally, and then put a little bit of super glue on either side of the actual slot on the miniature to help hold them in place. With a gel super glue like I'm using here, and like I would recommend you always use for this method because otherwise runny super glue is going to go everywhere, it's really easy to then sort of spread the super glue over the gaps, and because it's gel, it actually holds its shape over the gaps as well. In this case, I didn't put my cat litter on first, and you can see it's a little more difficult. I need to tilt the model, but because it has a slot, it's held in place, and it's not falling off the base when I'm trying to tilt it. So it all works out in the end. And by spreading that gel super glue around, you've actually entirely covered up the slot. The last thing here to prepare them for actual priming and painting is putting them onto painting grips. Now these painting grips I made in a previous video, so if you'd like to see that, it's in the card right now. And these painting grips are pretty handy. They're cheap, they're easy use, they're very small at the top and wide at the bottom, which makes them stable, but also means they don't obscure the edges of bases for painting, which is really the main reason I use them. You can hold your miniature in your hands, but then you can't really get around the edges of the base when you're trying to cover them up. As far as actual priming for the miniature goes, I do it with an airbrush as usual. This is a Badger Patriot 105 airbrush. I'm thinking of doing a airbrush tutorial, let's get technical, in the future. Let me know if you're interested in that. With the airbrush here, it gives me the opportunity to sort of blow away any extra baking soda just using the pressurized air, so that's really convenient, because not everything will tap off normally. So just blow it away that way. And then for actual primer, I use Vallejo Black Surface Primer. This applies really well through an airbrush. It applies okay with an actual paintbrush if you don't have an airbrush at home. But you do want to be careful you don't apply it too thickly with the paintbrush, because I found personally when I was doing that before I bought my airbrush that the primer gets a little bit of bubbles in it, and it collects bubbles in the crevices, and then you get an uneven surface. The airbrush is just a great tool for this because it goes on in a very, very thin layer that's very even all over the miniature. It doesn't collect anywhere, and you don't overdo it as long as you're careful while using your airbrush. It's great. And this means that you get a very tight coverage over the entire thing that doesn't obscure any surface details. Next, I'm going to grab some white airbrush paint and just go in over top of the miniatures from above, from what is called the zenith, to do what miniature modelers call zenithal highlighting, which is just highlighting things from above in order to sort of emulate the effect of daylight. It basically picks out the highlights for you in the shadows ahead of time. This is pretty useful when you're painting, if you're like me, in terms of just drawing out all of the detail for your eyes to be able to pick them out, because if you just had a black primer or just a white primer, it's a flat color and it's not very easy to tell what's what. As far as the actual painting goes here, it's pretty ordinary, so we'll kind of speed through it, but I just want to cover my materials first. So a lot of my paints are Artist's Loft. This is the brand of the art store Michaels, and my inks are P.H. Martin's Bombay India ink. I also use the 3 Vallejo paints shown on screen. Those are easily the most expensive materials here, and I'll sort of go over how I use them all in a minute. Before we get on to that, though, here's the model from episode 2 of the Guardsman project. He's got mustard armor and a pinkish-brown battle dress, and I like the warmth of those colors, and I like the overall design of this, so this is clearly what's inspiring my final design. But I'm going to punch up the vibrancy and the warmth of those colors because I really want to pull out some contrast with the green grass on the base and with the cool colors in the reflective visor. Contrast is not normally something you're necessarily looking for in terms of color contrast when designing a camouflage. You don't want to stand out from the background, but in terms of designing an artistically interesting miniature, yeah, it's cool. So I'm just going to roll with it, and after all, tigers do camouflage into their environments. Just as long as you're in some sort of bamboo forest or something, I guess it works. I'm going in with, an orangish brown. That's a combination of that amaranth red from Vallejo and their flesh tone to make that battle dress color. And then brown for the armor and weapon, white trim, still drawing on that sort of tiger concept here, just to add a little more detail. And I'm adding white to the tabs on both of the pockets. This is an inspiration from the Hammer Slammers series of short stories, where they have tabs that they can pull on to add medication or stimulants to themselves, basically through auto-injectors. I don't think these are auto-injectors because they're in cargo pants, but maybe they just mark the pockets that the actual medication and stimulant packages or whatever are located in on the character. So I'll paint those with colors in a minute. First, though, I did want to take a moment with the tiger stripes here and just sort of highlight how painstaking a process this is. It's easy to be watching, videos on the internet and tutorials and stuff like that in fast motion, and then go and try to do your own projects if you're just starting out and think like, wow, I'm so slow. Those guys and gals on the internet are so fast. It's not, or at least not in my case. Maybe some people are really, really fast with kind of free-handed details like this in particular. I'm not. And I think for the most part, the fast motion on YouTube, the acceleration that makes it easier to present these things in a, cogent package, can also misrepresent things a little bit, stuff like speed painting and stuff like that. And I know it was kind of discouraging when I was first trying to paint miniatures, just to think how long it took me to do stuff. But definitely for details and stuff like this, it does just take a long time. Coming back to those pocket tabs, I'm painting one blue and one red for the stimulants and medical kit respectively, which should help identify them in case of buddy aid between wounded soldiers and stuff like that. Going on to actual homemade washing now. This is kind of interesting. So I don't use washes store-bought. I find I often don't like how strong they are, personally. I use them occasionally, but generally I have to go back in and do something with my own anyway. So here's a mixture of basically brown Bombay ink, airbrush flow improver from Vallejo, a little bit of black ink as you can see, and a lot of water. I want a really thin wash here because I don't want something that's just gonna muss everything up. Really, I want to darken down the overall color of the miniature very, very slightly, so that going over everything again will make it look like highlights, but fairly subtle highlights, just adding texture, while this wash also collects in the crevices. I want to make sure this wash is also brown, and that Bombay brown ink is really convenient for this because it's a fairly warm brown, so it blends well with pretty much anything, flesh tone or camouflage. Just to sort of not have deep black crevices, but instead crevices of roughly the same tone as the actual color. And now, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over all of that again, because the wash has darkened everything down slightly. Adding the main colors back in now, selectively over smaller areas to highlight sort of raised areas and the large broad parts of the camouflage, is going to give the impression of how do you say that in English? Relief, which is to say sort of a surface texture. It's going to make things look raised and shadowed maybe more than they actually are, or at least emphasize the nice creases that are on this sculpt from a distance. So by doing this, try to keep the areas fairly neat and linear so they don't look like patches almost from a distance. I'm not going for leopard spot, I'm going for tiger stripe. So I'm trying to keep things relatively linear and relatively kept to the actual raised areas of the model. I'm then going to go into the actual tiger stripes again and just hit them with a little more black to make them look a little more pure, because the brown wash dulled them down. This isn't necessarily that important, but with a matte varnish coming at the very end of this, that's also going to dull them down a little bit, and I was afraid that they would just not show very well or look kind of muddy. The issue with a lot of camouflages and textures on miniatures is if you don't do them very clearly and don't do them very well, they end up just looking like bad painting. So I didn't want that to be the case with these miniatures. On the actual armor, I mixed a little bit of that amaranth red into the camouflage medium brown used for the armor, and that gave me a warm highlight that I'm just going to put around the edges of all the armor bits, the helmet, shoulder pads, backpack, that kind of stuff, just implying a little bit more warmth and making them pop out. I had an issue now with my cat litter where I think I got it wet with the airbrush when I was first spraying things because I just washed my airbrush. So a lot of the cat litter crumbled. I just put more super glue on, more cat litter, and then put a little bit of primer over top, and I had texture on the model again. We're getting on now to maybe the most interesting part of this whole tutorial, which is how to make a reflective visor, and it is maybe not as hard as you think. The first thing I'm going to do here, earlier I painted up the actual visors with the pale gray color that I was using sort of as the white trim around the battle dress. Now I'm going to go in with black around the edges, sorry for the focus there, and just darken those down so it looks like it's fading down into the recesses of the helmet. And then I'm going to work my way in with a bit of a horizon scene, sort of a Windows wallpaper sort of deal, I think is how my brother described these when he saw them, by going from green at the bottom to blue at the top. The really important thing here is to make a lot of contrast, you need to alternate dark and light. So it's going to be dark at the top, the very highest point of the sky, going towards light and ultimately almost white at the horizon, which should be sort of a line crossing the visor and separating it horizontally. And then below that, I'm going to go dark green close to the horizon, where the land would be furthest away and sort of desaturated, up to a light green at the bottom of the visor, where it would be closest to the character. And if you sort of want inspiration for this kind of thing, your best bet, or at least what I did anyway, is I just sort of took pictures of a horizon and I shrank them down to thumbnail size, very, very, very small, just to get an idea of how the general colors flowed through each other. By doing it this way, you can get all sorts of different skies. I saw a great picture on Instagram by somebody who made a sort of astronaut with a Mars landscape, so sort of a red land and going towards black sky. Very, very cool. And it's all sort of the same concept of alternating bands of dark and light so that you create a lot of contrast so things stand out from each other. And once you kind of know that, this is the same concept that if you follow my Battletech videos, same idea as what I was doing there, but more refined, because in those videos I largely just use inks to flow them into the right places. Here I'm actually going in with paints and deliberately making a landscape. And this sort of reflection, in my opinion, I thought it was fun. It was an interesting thought exercise. It was an interesting exercise in painting skill. And it was pretty hard to do with shaky hands, I guess, but I'm very proud of how it turned out. And I think you should try something like this on your own miniatures, because it's very visually interesting as well. So it'll make your model stand out on the tabletop for sure. This gives a really effective and vibrant effect in actually less time than it takes to paint the tiger stripes on these guys, so give it a shot. So now we're on to finishing touches, and in this case that mostly involves working on the bases. Now bases are kind of cool because they're a great opportunity for you to make a small diorama, since they do divide out your miniature from the tabletop, unless you're using acrylic or something that you can see straight through, I guess. You want to put a little bit of care into just picking what kind of environment your guys are going to be in for the duration of their playtime. In my case, that's mostly grassland, so that everything sort of matches up with each other, but in this case, I'm going a little bit more arid than usual. A lot more rocks, and I'm going to go with some static grass tufts that I've never really used before. So here, I'm just doing the dark gray from the actual trim on the armor and the rocks, and then brown on the bases themselves, obviously, for mud or dirt. And then the static grass tufts over top, I think they give the impression of a sort of deserty, tall grass kind of deal. They don't quite match up with my normal flock, but I think that works fine for just different plants. I apply the static grass tufts into small dabs of gel superglue using tweezers, so I can do it really precisely and sort of position them around the base as I want them to be. I aim for patches of lots of rocks because they seem to me like something that would sprout out of particularly arid or rocky ground, and I try to make things asymmetrical and a little random around the bases. I don't want to crowd any particular part, but I also want all of the bases to have one or two of these tufts just to draw everything together across the entire army. By slapping these guys on sort of here and there, I make a bit of a patchy, arid ground look, and I think the arid ground look kind of justifies the brown armor a little bit at least. For the actual flock, I use a mixture of static grass, dill, and oregano to emulate sort of fallen leaves and sticks, and in this case, I'm just applying it very, very lightly in small patches, keeping with that arid theme, instead of applying it across the entire base like I would normally do with my miniatures. Finally, I hit them with a matte varnish. I didn't record that, sorry, but it is basically the same thing, just airbrushing on a matte varnish like I did with the primer. And then I come back here and I actually put primer around the edge of the bases. I used to use black flow acrylic and this works just fine, but I've got a commission going on right now where I'm working on metal miniatures on metal bases, metal washers. If you're interested in that, you can watch my video on painting US Army GIs that came out 2 weeks ago. And I'm just doing the base edges of those with primer, and I find it looks fine as well. And primer is quite solid and durable, so it's a great option for doing the edges of your bases as well. With all that being said, I'm finally finished off the first 6 miniatures of the Guardsman project. I didn't talk too much about the plasma gun operator there. He or she was a bit of a different project. Wanted to test out my new airbrush that I purchased recently, which was kind of fun. I don't know how the glow effect turned out in my opinion, so I'm probably going to come back to something like that in a later video. But as far as the actual normal infantrymen go, I hope you enjoyed that and I hope you learned something. The actual visor effect, the reflective effect, I think is not as hard as it looks, and you should definitely give it a shot on something. If you are into Battletech, canopies are a great opportunity to try something like that. And otherwise, visors on miniatures or windscreens on vehicles are also great opportunities for it. I hope you've enjoyed following along with this latest step of the Guardsman project, and I hope you're looking forward to future videos as well. I may be on a brief hiatus for a little while here, or at least videos will get a little more intermittent because my first son is actually due anytime in the next few weeks. So if you don't see a video come out in 2 weeks on the normal schedule, that's probably why. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, thank you for all your support, and as usual, go play some games.